The first time Vincent Moretti saw me, I was standing alone in a wedding dress nobody wanted to pay for. The ballroom smelled like expensive flowers and cold champagne. Crystal chandeliers glowed above 200 guests who suddenly found their phones more interesting than my face. Nobody looked directly at me anymore. Not after Daniel disappeared 40 minutes before the ceremony. His mother was the first one to break the silence. "This embarrassment should have stayed private," she whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear. I remember tightening my fingers around the bouquet until the stems bent against my skin. White roses, imported from Oregon, $300 a bundle. My mother would have called them wasteful. The string quartet kept playing anyway. Slow, awkward, violins filling spaces where dignity used to live. I should have cried. That's what everyone expected. A ruined bride, mascara running down her cheeks. Some tragic little scene people could gossip about over dessert later. But humiliation has a strange way of exhausting you before the tears arrive. So I just stood there, breathing carefully, shoulders straight, trying not to let the weight of that dress drag me to the floor. Then the room changed. You could feel it before you saw him. Conversations died first. Then movement. Even the waiters slowed down. Vincent Moretti walked into the ballroom like he owned the oxygen inside it. Black suit, dark overcoat folded over one arm, calm eyes that never rushed toward anything. I knew his name before anyone whispered it. Everybody in Chicago knew his name. Men lowered their voices around him. Businesses survived because he allowed them to. The newspapers called him a billionaire investor. The city called him something else when cameras weren't around. He wasn't supposed to be there for me. He came because Daniel's father owed him money. That's what I learned later. But that night, Vincent stopped walking the moment he saw me standing alone at the altar. His gaze didn't move immediately. That was the strange part. Most men looked at me with pity, some with discomfort. Vincent looked at me like he was trying to understand something expensive and dangerous. Daniel's mother rushed toward him instantly, forcing a brittle smile. "Mr. Moretti, I'm terribly sorry about this disaster." Vincent barely acknowledged her. His eyes stayed on me. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. "Just the bride," she answered. "Just the bride." I think that sentence hurt more than Daniel leaving. Vincent looked at the half-empty ballroom, the abandoned champagne tower, the photographers pretending not to stare. Then his attention returned to me again. Slow, focused, uncomfortable. "No," he said calmly. "That's not what I asked." For the first time all night, somebody sounded angry on my behalf. I should have looked away. Any sane woman would have. But there was something unsettling about a man who never needed to raise his voice to control a room. So I met his eyes instead. And for 1 second, the humiliation disappeared. Not because he saved me. He didn't. Not yet. But because Vincent Moretti looked at me like I was still standing. Like the world hadn't managed to break me in front of him. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated us. The music had stopped completely now. Even the air felt quieter. His gaze dropped briefly to the small white dove stitched into the edge of my veil by hand. My grandmother used to sew them onto important dresses for luck. Vincent noticed it immediately. Of course he did. Men like him noticed everything. "Little dove," he said softly. Nobody had ever called me that before. The words should have sounded ridiculous coming from a man like him. Instead, they sounded dangerous. Because the moment Vincent Moretti said it, the entire room understood something I didn't yet know. He had looked at me twice. And men like him never did anything twice unless they planned on keeping it. People look at you differently after public humiliation. Some stare too long. Some pretend not to notice you at all. But the worst ones smile softly like they are relieved it happened to someone else. 3 days after the wedding, I learned that lesson walking through downtown Chicago with grocery bags digging into my fingers. October wind pushed cold air through the streets hard enough to sting my cheeks. Everybody else wore heavy coats already. Mine was still too thin for the season because canceled weddings do not come with refund policies. I kept my head down and walked faster when I passed restaurant windows. Every television inside seemed to replay the same charity gala footage from years ago where Daniel and I looked happy together. I had become a cautionary tale in under 72 hours. By Monday morning, even the bookstore felt different. Hawthorne Books sat on a quiet corner near West Belmont Avenue, squeezed between a coffee shop and an old tailor who never smiled at anyone. I liked working there because books never asked humiliating questions. They just waited patiently to be understood. Mrs. Green, the owner, handed me a stack of returned hardcovers and tried not to mention the wedding. "Take your time shelving these," she said gently. That was her version of kindness, letting silence protect people. Around noon, rain started tapping against the front windows, soft at first, then steady enough to turn the sidewalk silver. The shop smelled like coffee beans and old paper while jazz music hummed quietly from the back office radio. For the first time in days, I almost felt normal again. Then the man walked in, mid-40s, expensive watch, smug smile, the kind of man who enjoyed making cashiers uncomfortable because nobody ever stopped him. He wandered the aisles pretending to browse until he reached the register. "You look familiar," he said. I kept scanning his purchase. "I do not think so." "No," he replied slowly. "You are the runaway bride." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they hurt, because I was tired of belonging to that moment already. "Actually," I said calmly, "I was the one who stayed." His grin twitched slightly. For half a second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he leaned against the counter. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "if you need a replacement husband, I could probably help." I looked up then, directly at him. "I would rather marry the coffee machine." Mrs. Green nearly choked, trying not to laugh in the back room. The man's face tightened immediately. Embarrassed men always become louder. "You should be grateful. Anyone is offering," he muttered before grabbing his bag and leaving. The bell above the door snapped sharply as he disappeared into the rain. My heart was beating harder than I wanted to admit. Not because I felt threatened, because standing up for yourself when your confidence is broken feels like lifting weights with an injured arm. Mrs. Green stepped beside me a minute later holding 2 paper cups of tea. "You handled that well," she said. I shrugged. "I am tired of people acting like I should apologize for being left behind." She studied me carefully over the rim of her cup. "Most people would have cried by now." I stared out the rain-streaked window. "I already did," I answered quietly. "Just not where anybody could use it against me." That night, the man from the bookstore never came home to his penthouse apartment overlooking Lakeshore Drive. Nothing terrible happened to him. Nothing dramatic. But by morning, every investment account tied to his company had been quietly frozen under federal investigation. His law firm dropped him before lunch. By Friday, he had left Chicago completely. And somewhere across the city, Vincent Moretti sat silently in the back seat of a black Mercedes, while someone nervously explained every detail of my day to him. The first gift arrived on a Wednesday morning hidden inside ordinary life. No card, no flowers, no dramatic surprise waiting at my apartment door. Just silence. The kind that changes things slowly before you realize they are changing at all. I was halfway through organizing the new fiction arrivals at Hawthorne Books when Mrs. Green appeared beside me holding a stack of invoices against her chest. She looked confused. "Ellie," she said carefully, "did you tell someone about the leak?" I glanced up from the cart. "What leak?" "The one above the history section." She pointed toward the back corner of the store where a brown water stain spread across the ceiling like spilled coffee. "Someone already paid contractors to fix it." I frowned immediately. Maybe the landlord finally did his job. "No," she lowered her voice. "They already started this morning." Through the front window, I could see 2 men unloading. Equipment from a white truck parked outside. New ladders, industrial fans, plastic covers. Professional. Fast. Nobody in Chicago fixed things that quickly unless there was a reason. Mrs. Green studied me over her glasses. "Do you know anything about this?" "No," I answered honestly, but something cold moved quietly through my chest anyway. Around noon, one of the contractors approached the register carrying paperwork. Need a signature confirming the payment cleared, he said politely. Mrs. Green blinked. Payment. The man checked the clipboard. Already handled in full. He slid the document toward her. I only caught a glimpse of the number before she quickly flipped the page over. $7,400. My stomach tightened immediately. Nobody spends that kind of money on a small bookstore ceiling. Not unless the bookstore itself matters. Or someone inside it does. That night, I tried convincing myself it had nothing to do with Vincent Moretti. Chicago was full of wealthy people with strange hobbies and stranger accountants. But deep down, I already knew. Because 2 days earlier, my mother's hospital called to tell us an anonymous donor had covered the remaining balance on her cardiac treatment plan. $12,000 erased in under 10 minutes. The receptionist sounded emotional while explaining it. There are still good people in the world, she kept saying softly. I sat in my car for almost an hour afterward staring at the steering wheel. My mother thought maybe Daniel was trying to apologize indirectly. But Daniel did not apologize for things. He escaped them. Besides, apologies from men like Daniel arrived through text messages and weak excuses. Not life-changing amounts of money. The realization followed me everywhere after that. Through grocery stores, through train stations, through quiet walks home after work while cold November wind swept dead leaves across the sidewalks. I started noticing black vehicles parked too long near my apartment building. Different drivers. Same pattern. Watching without appearing to watch. One Friday evening, I tested the feeling deliberately. I left the bookstore 30 minutes earlier than usual and crossed 3 separate streets before doubling back toward a coffee shop window. The black sedan still turned the corner behind me exactly 12 seconds later. My pulse stumbled once. Not fear exactly. Awareness. The dangerous kind. Inside the car, Vincent sat in the rear seat reading financial reports beneath soft amber lighting. His driver spoke without turning around. She noticed the security rotation. Vincent continued reading another page before answering. No, he said calmly. She noticed the pattern. There was a difference. Men underestimated women constantly because they confused kindness with ignorance. Vincent did not make that mistake. Do you want us farther back? The driver asked. Vincent finally looked out the tinted window toward the sidewalk where I walked alone beneath glowing streetlights. No, he replied quietly. If she feels unsafe, we failed already. Across the street, I paused beside a bakery window glowing warm against the cold night. Reflection moved faintly across the glass. Black sedan. Headlights low. Waiting. Watching. I should have felt angry. Maybe I did a little. But underneath the confusion was something worse. Relief. Because for the first time since the wedding, the city no longer felt empty around me. And somewhere deep down, I hated myself for understanding exactly how dangerous that feeling could become. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets still carried the smell of wet concrete and gasoline. New York always looked honest after midnight, like the city was too tired to lie anymore. I sat near the window of the diner, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Across the street, men in dark coats guarded the entrance of Luca Moretti's building like statues carved from stone. Nobody smiled around him. Nobody relaxed. Even silence stood up straighter when he entered a room. I told myself I was only there because he had asked to see me. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. Since the night he stepped into my life, every normal thing had started feeling temporary. The bell above the diner door rang softly. I looked up before my mind could stop me. Luca walked in alone. This time, no bodyguards. No expensive arrogance. Just a black coat damp from the rain and those impossible gray eyes scanning the room until they found me. He sat across from me without speaking. The waitress appeared instantly, nervous, pretending not to recognize him. "Coffee," he said quietly. His voice always sounded controlled, like every word had survived a war before leaving his mouth. When she walked away, he looked at my untouched cup. "You have been waiting too long. You asked me to come. And you still came." I hated the way my heart reacted to that sentence. He noticed everything. The slight shift in my breathing. The the tension in my shoulders. Luca leaned back slowly, watching the street through the window beside me. Someone followed you tonight. My stomach tightened. What? A gray sedan. 2 men inside. He said it casually, like discussing weather. My men took care of it. Took care of it how? His eyes returned to mine. Calm. Heavy. Dangerous in a way that did not need to announce itself. You do not want details. The waitress returned with his coffee. Her hands trembled slightly, placing it down. Luca thanked her politely. That almost scared me more than his silence. Because monsters were easier to survive when they looked like monsters. He waited until she left before speaking again. You should leave the city for a while. No, you did not even think about it. Because running will not fix whatever this is. For the first time that night, something almost human crossed his face. Exhaustion. You think this world can be understood with courage alone. And you think fear solves everything. He stared at me for several seconds. The diner noise faded into the background. Dishes clinking. Old music humming softly overhead. Outside, headlights moved across wet pavement like ghosts. When I was 19, he said quietly, my father taught me that power only matters if people are afraid to touch what belongs to you. I swallowed hard. And do you believe that? I believed him for a very long time. His fingers tapped once against the coffee cup. Then you walked into my life and spoke to me like I was still human. The words landed. Harder than they should have. Luca Moretti was feared by judges, politicians, men with private armies. But right then, sitting across from me in a quiet diner at 1:30 in the morning, he looked unbearably alone. My voice softened before I could stop it. Maybe you still are. His jaw tightened slightly, like hope itself irritated him. Then his phone vibrated once against the table. He glanced down at the screen. Whatever he saw erased every trace of softness from his face. The temperature around him seemed to drop instantly. What happened? I asked. Luca stood slowly, eyes locked on the message. There was a problem at the docks. What kind of problem? He looked at me for one long second. The kind that reminds people who I am. Something cold moved through my chest. Because I suddenly understood the truth nobody in the city wanted to admit. Luca Moretti was trying very hard not to become the man the world expected him to be. And I was terrified that one day, the world would win. The clock on my apartment wall read 3:17 in the morning when the first siren echoed through the city. I had not slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Luca standing inside that diner, half lost between the man he used to be and the man he was trying not to become. Outside my window, Manhattan glowed beneath low clouds and neon reflections. Beautiful, restless, dangerous. My phone vibrated against the kitchen counter hard enough to make me jump. Unknown number. I stared at it for 2 rings before answering. Hello. Silence breathed through the speaker for a second. Then Luca's voice arrived low and controlled. Are you home? My chest tightened instantly. Yes. Lock the door. Luca, what happened? I heard movement behind him. Car engines. Distant voices. The sound of rain beginning again. Someone leaked information from inside my organization, he said. And now people are asking questions about you. Fear moved quietly through me. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just cold enough to settle into my bones. Why me? Because they think you matter to me. The apartment suddenly felt too small. Too exposed. I walked toward the window and pulled the curtain closed. Do I? The line went silent again. Not because he did not know the answer. Because he did. I should not have involved you, he finally said. But it is too late for distance now. I pressed my fingers against my forehead, trying to steady my breathing. What are you asking me to do? Pack a bag. My stomach dropped. No. Listen to me carefully. His voice sharpened slightly, not angry but urgent. A car will arrive in 10 minutes. Matteo is driving. You will go with him. I am not disappearing into one of your safe houses. This is not a negotiation. The words should have made me angry. Instead, they scared me. because Luca never sounded emotional. But right then, beneath all the control, I heard it. Fear. Real fear. And somehow that terrified me more than the danger itself. Luca, I whispered. Where are you? He exhaled slowly. At the docks. In the background, thunder rolled over the harbor. I imagined him standing near black water and shipping containers under flashing lights, wearing that dark coat like armor against the entire world. Alone even when surrounded by men. You sound tired, I said softly. A small pause followed. I am. Then leave. He almost laughed at that. Not amusement. Something sadder. Men like me do not get to leave. Before I could answer, someone spoke to him in Italian on the other side of the call. His tone changed instantly when he replied. Colder. Harder. The version of Luca Moretti the city feared. Then he returned to me. The car is almost there. I do not want protection. Too bad. The words came softer this time. Familiar somehow. Like he was trying to hold on to something human before the night swallowed him again. Why are you really doing this? I asked quietly. Because everyone close to me eventually becomes a target. The honesty in that sentence hit harder than any threat could have. I leaned against the counter, eyes closed. And what happens if I refuse? I will still protect you. Even if I hate you for it? Another pause. Longer this time. Heavy enough to carry things neither of us knew how to say. I could survive your anger, he said quietly. I could not survive your funeral. My breath caught in my throat. Outside, headlights swept across my apartment walls. A black sedan pulled up below the building exactly 10 minutes after the call began. Luca already knew the timing before he said it. That was the frightening thing about powerful men. They prepared for disaster before normal people even noticed danger existed. Matteo is there, he said. Go downstairs. What about you? Rain crackled through the phone line. Then his voice lowered into something dangerously close to tenderness. I will come find you when the city stops trying to kill me. And then the line went dead. The house sat far beyond the city limits where the noise of Manhattan could no longer reach. No sirens. No traffic. Just trees moving in the wind and rain tapping softly against tall windows. Matteo parked the sedan beneath a covered entrance and stepped out first, scanning the darkness automatically before opening my door. He looked older than Luca. Broader shoulders. Tired eyes that had probably seen too much for too many years. Inside, he said gently. Not cold like Luca's men usually sounded. Careful. Respectful. The house itself felt expensive without trying to impress anyone. Dark wood floors. Soft amber lights. Fire burning low inside a stone fireplace. It smelled like cedar and old books instead of danger. Somehow that unsettled me more. Matteo carried my bag upstairs while I stood in the living room listening to the storm outside. How long am I supposed to stay here? I asked. He paused near the staircase. Until Luca says it is safe. And when will that be? His expression barely changed. That depends on how many enemies he makes before sunrise. The honesty hit harder than comfort would have. Matteo disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone with thoughts that refused to stay quiet. Luca was somewhere in the city fighting battles I could not even see. And for the first time in my life, I understood what power really cost. It isolated people long before it destroyed them. I barely slept. Every sound in the house pulled me awake again. Floorboards settling. Wind against glass. Distant thunder rolling through the hills. By morning, gray light filled the kitchen while I stood, making coffee I did not even want. Matteo entered wearing a black sweater instead of a suit now, though nothing about him looked relaxed. You should eat, he said. I am not hungry. He nodded once like he expected that answer. Then he placed a newspaper on the counter beside me. Luca's name was not printed anywhere, but the headline mentioned financial investigations at the harbor and several businesses connected to organized crime. The city always avoided saying his name directly. Fear had its own grammar in New York. Is he okay? I asked quietly. Matteo studied me carefully before answering. He is alive. Not reassuring. Just truthful. I looked back down at the paper. How long have you worked for him? Since he was 22. Then you know him better than anyone. Matteo leaned against the counter slowly. Nobody truly knows Luca Moretti. You do. A faint shadow crossed his face. I know what he protects. And what is that? He glanced toward the rain outside before answering. People he loves. The words stayed with me long after he left the kitchen. Around noon, the storm finally weakened. I wandered through the house restlessly until I found a locked study near the back hallway. The door stood slightly open. Inside, shelves filled with books covered the walls. History, philosophy, art. Nothing I expected from a man like Luca. On the desk sat an old photograph in a silver frame. I picked it up carefully. A younger Luca stared back at me from the picture, maybe 17 years old. No expensive suit. No cold expression. Just a serious boy standing beside a woman with soft eyes and dark hair touching his shoulder proudly. His mother. I knew it instantly. The same gray eyes. The same sadness hidden underneath silence. Footsteps stopped behind me. I turned sharply. Luca stood in the doorway. Rain still darkened his coat. Exhaustion carved shadows beneath his eyes. But he was alive. Relief hit me so fast it almost hurt. Neither of us spoke at first. The room suddenly felt smaller with him inside it. He noticed the photograph in my hands and walked closer slowly. She hated this picture, he said quietly. Why? Because she said I already looked too serious. I looked back at the young man frozen inside the frame. You loved her. His jaw tightened slightly. She was the last good thing in my life before everything changed. The honesty in his voice felt dangerously intimate. Luca stepped closer until only inches separated us. I could hear the rainwater dripping softly from his coat onto the hardwood floor. Did anyone hurt you while I was gone? He asked. No, he nodded once. Relief flashing briefly across his face before disappearing again beneath control. Then his hand lifted slowly toward my cheek before stopping halfway. Like even tenderness had become unfamiliar to him. I thought about you all night, he admitted softly. That was a mistake. But neither of us moved away. The air between us changed after that moment in the study. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make every silence feel heavier than before. Luca lowered his hand slowly. Like touching me would cross a line he had spent years building around himself. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows behind him, while the fire downstairs cracked softly through the quiet house. You should rest, he said at last. His voice returned to controlled calm, but I could still hear the exhaustion underneath it. You have not slept either. A faint shadow of amusement touched his expression. Sleep and I stopped being friends a long time ago. He moved past me toward the desk, loosening his tie slightly as though even breathing had become work. Up close, I noticed the strain he tried to hide. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements slower than usual. Men like Luca carried pressure the way soldiers carried scars. Quietly, permanently. When was the last time you ate? I asked. He looked almost confused by the question. I do not remember. That is not healthy. Neither is my profession. I crossed my arms. That was not a joke. Luca studied me carefully for a second before looking away. You sound angry. Because you act like your life is disposable. Something flickered across his face then. Not anger. Surprise. Like nobody had spoken to him that honestly in years. He leaned one hand against the edge of the desk. You think caring about me will change what I am? No, I answered quietly. But maybe it changes what you become. The room fell silent again. Heavy. Breathing. Dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or enemies. Luca walked toward the bookshelf slowly, eyes distant now. My father believed weakness was the fastest way to lose power, he said. He taught me to remove anything that could be used against me, including emotions, especially emotions. His voice sounded colder when speaking about the past, like every memory arrived carrying frost. I watched him carefully. And your mother? He stopped moving. For several seconds, only rain filled the silence. She spent her entire life trying to convince me that kindness was not weakness. His jaw tightened slightly. She died before I understood what she meant. The sadness in that sentence settled deep inside my chest. Luca Moretti was feared by half the city. Yet grief still followed him like a shadow that never fully disappeared. I stepped closer carefully. You are not your father. He gave a quiet laugh without humor. You do not know the things I have done. Maybe not. I held his gaze steadily. But I know people who enjoy cruelty do not lose sleep over becoming monsters. Something shifted in his expression then. Small, almost invisible, but real. Like part of him wanted desperately to believe me. A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Matteo opened the study door without waiting long enough for permission. There is a problem, he said carefully. Luca's entire posture changed instantly. Softer emotions disappeared beneath steel. What happened? The leak came from inside the financial office. Matteo glanced briefly toward me before continuing. Someone close to your uncle. Luca's face darkened slightly at the mention of family. Not fear. Disappointment, which somehow felt worse. How much damage? Enough to attract federal attention. Matteo paused. And enough for people to start asking why a civilian suddenly disappeared from Manhattan 2 nights ago. I felt my stomach tighten. Luca did not look at me immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor for one long second while calculations moved. Silently behind them, then he turned toward me with terrifying calm. You cannot go home yet. Luca? No, his voice remained quiet but absolute. Until I know who betrayed me. This house is the safest place for you. I hated that part of me felt relieved hearing it. Matteo handed Luca a folder before leaving the room again. Luca opened it slowly, scanning several photographs and financial reports. The tension in his face sharpened with every page. Your uncle did this? I asked carefully. I do not know yet. But you suspect him. Luca closed the folder. Power changes people. I looked at him steadily. And has it changed you? The question landed harder than I expected. He stared at me without answering at first. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the hills again, while evening shadows stretched through the study. Finally, Luca stepped closer until his voice dropped almost to a whisper. Every day, he admitted. That is why meeting you scared me. My heartbeat stumbled painfully against my ribs. Because for the first time since all this began, I realized something dangerous. Luca was not protecting me only because enemies wanted leverage. He was protecting me because somewhere along the way, I had become the last part of himself he did not want the darkness to destroy. That night, the house felt quieter than before. Not peaceful, just fragile. Like something important had shifted beneath the surface and neither of us knew how to stop it now. Luca left the study shortly after our conversation, disappearing into endless phone calls and closed doors, while Matteo and several men moved through the halls with tense expressions. I tried reading in the living room, but every few minutes I caught myself listening for Luca's footsteps instead. Somewhere near midnight, the electricity flickered once during the storm. The fire dimmed briefly before recovering. Outside, wind bent the trees hard enough to make branches scrape against the windows like restless fingers. I stood near the fireplace staring into the flames when Luca finally entered the room again. His tie was gone now. The top button of his shirt hung open slightly, revealing exhaustion he no longer had. Energy to hide. You are still awake, he said quietly. So are you. He glanced toward the rain outside. Bad habit. I folded my arms carefully. You disappear for hours and expect me not to worry? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Luca looked at me differently after that. Not surprised anymore. Almost resigned. Like he had already lost the battle against whatever this connection between us had become. He walked closer slowly, stopping near the fireplace where warm light softened the sharpness of his features. You should not care this much about me. Maybe you should stop giving me reasons to. A faint breath escaped him. Not quite laughter. You make dangerous choices very casually, says the man running half of New York. That actually pulled a small smile from him. Brief, real enough to change the entire room. And suddenly I understood why powerful men frighten cities. Because when they finally showed softness, it felt devastatingly personal. Luca sat down in the armchair across from me, leaning forward slightly with his elbows resting on his knees. The firelight moved across his face while silence settled between us again. Comfortable this time. Matteo told me you found my mother's photograph, he said. You looked happy in it. I was. His eyes lowered briefly. Before my father died, our family was different. What happened after? Luca stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. Power attracts people who only understand fear. His voice sounded distant now, pulled backward through memory. After my father was killed, men started circling our family like wolves. Politicians, rivals, business partners pretending to mourn him while calculating what they could take from us. I watched him quietly. And you protected your mother. I tried. The sadness in those two words nearly broke me. Luca Moretti carried guilt the way other people carried names. Permanently attached. He rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw before continuing. By 24, I had already become someone she no longer recognized. Do you think she stopped loving you? He looked up immediately. No, his answer came too fast, too certain. She just hated what this world turned me into. Outside, thunder rolled again across the hills. I moved closer to the fireplace, sitting on the rug beside it while warmth pressed against my skin. Luca watched me carefully, his expression unreadable. You know what scares me most about you? I asked softly. Tell me. You act like being feared is the same thing as being respected. His jaw tightened slightly. In my world, sometimes it is. No, I shook my head slowly. Fear only keeps people silent. It does not make them loyal. Luca leaned back in the chair, studying me with the same intensity he probably used during negotiations and wars. And what creates loyalty? Feeling safe. The answer hung between us quietly. Something changed in his eyes after that. Not dramatic. Just enough to reveal the tired man beneath the reputation. Nobody has ever said things like that to me before, he admitted. That is because everyone around you is terrified. A long silence followed. Then Luca stood slowly and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the dark woods. His reflection stared back at him through rain and shadows. When this is over, he said quietly, you should leave New York. My chest tightened instantly. Why? Because eventually this life destroys everything near it. Maybe I should decide that for myself. He turned toward me then, eyes heavy with something deeper than fear now. Regret. You still think there is something worth saving inside me. I held his gaze steadily. I know there is. Luca looked away immediately after that, like hope itself had become too painful to hold for very long. And in that moment, standing beside the rain-covered glass while the storm swallowed the world outside, he no longer looked like the most dangerous man in New York. He looked like someone exhausted from surviving his own darkness alone. Morning arrived quietly over the estate. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the woods soaked in silver light and fog drifting between the trees. I had barely slept again. Every conversation with Luca stayed inside my head long after the words ended, replaying themselves in quiet corners of my mind like songs too heavy to forget. Downstairs, the house felt unusually tense. Men moved through the hallways speaking in lowered voices. Phones rang constantly. Matteo stood near the kitchen window with a tablet in one hand and exhaustion written across his face. Something happened, I said immediately. He looked at me for a second before answering. News stations are reporting federal investigations into several businesses connected to Luca's family. My stomach tightened. Is he here? Matteo nodded once toward the study. Since 5 this morning. I walked through the hallway slowly, hearing muffled voices behind the closed door before everything suddenly went silent. A second later, Luca stepped out. His expression hardened instantly when he saw me standing there barefoot and worried. You should not be awake yet. Neither should you. He almost smiled at that, but whatever exhaustion he carried was heavier today. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His movements looked sharper now, driven by pressure instead of adrenaline. "What is happening?" I asked quietly. Luca glanced briefly toward Matteo before looking back at me. "Someone released financial records connected to my uncle's companies." "The same uncle you suspected?" "Yes." "So he betrayed you." Luca's jaw tightened. "I still do not know if betrayal is the right word. What else would you call it?" His eyes drifted toward the window. "Family." The sadness in that single word lingered between us. Luca walked past me into the kitchen, loosening his cuffs while Matteo handed him another folder. I noticed how every person around him watched carefully for reactions. Like the emotional weather of the entire house depended on the way Luca breathed. He scanned several documents before tossing them onto the counter with controlled frustration. "They froze 3 accounts overnight," he muttered. Matteo nodded. "And reporters are already waiting outside the Manhattan office." Luca rubbed both hands across his face slowly. For the first time since meeting him, he looked less like a feared businessman and more like a man drowning while trying not to alarm everyone watching from shore. "You cannot carry all of this alone," I said softly. His eyes lifted toward me immediately. "I have been doing exactly that for years." "Maybe that is the problem." Matteo quietly left the room after that, giving us privacy without being asked. Luca leaned against the counter while silence stretched between us again. Warm sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows now, touching the sharp lines of his face in ways darkness never could. "You still think I can change," he said quietly. "I think you already want to." He gave a tired laugh beneath his breath. "Wanting something does not make it possible." I stepped closer carefully. "Then why do you keep protecting people?" Luca stared at me for several seconds before answering. "Because I know what it feels like when nobody does." The honesty in his voice nearly broke me apart. I realized then that Luca Moretti had spent most of his life surviving instead of living. Every wall around him had been built from grief, fear, and responsibility handed to him far too young. "You are not alone anymore," I whispered. The words changed something inside the room. I saw it happen in real time. The way his breathing slowed slightly. The way his eyes softened before he could stop them. Luca looked down briefly, like even hearing those words felt dangerous. Then suddenly his phone rang again. He answered immediately, expression hardening as he listened. "When?" he asked sharply. Silence followed while someone spoke on the other end. Then his entire posture went still. Not angry. Worse. Controlled. "Do not move until I arrive," he ordered quietly before ending the call. "What happened?" I asked. Luca slid the phone back into his pocket slowly. "My uncle is gone." Cold moved through my chest. "Gone where?" "Nobody knows." Matteo reappeared in the doorway instantly after hearing the tension in Luca's voice. "The car is ready," he said. Luca nodded once before turning toward me. And for the first time since all this began, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not for himself. For me. "You stay inside this house," he said firmly. "No matter who calls. No matter what they say." "Luca!" He stepped closer suddenly, voice lowering into something raw and dangerously sincere. "If anything happens today, promise me you will leave New York." My heartbeat stumbled painfully. "Why would you say that?" His eyes held mine for one heavy second. "Because people only threaten the things that matter to you." And then he walked away before I could answer, leaving the front door closing softly behind him while fear settled into the silence he left behind.